Welcome to the Expert Series, where we explore the issues shaping Canadian national security and defense. I'm Angelina Smolinek, Research Assistant at the CDA Institute, and I'm joined today by former Minister of National Defense Peter MacKay to discuss defense issues relevant to the upcoming Canadian election. In this episode, we cover the changing US-Canada relationship, cooperating with NATO allies in the Arctic and Ukraine, and what more needs to be done here in Canada to strengthen our procurement and recruitment systems. This is the Expert Series. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mr. MacKay. In a recent piece you wrote for the National Post, you touch on the mutually beneficial defense relationship between Canada and the United States. How do you see the recent rhetoric on Canadian politics and sovereignty impacting this relationship between the two countries, and in particular, if it will affect cooperation on continental defense?
Sure. Well, firstly, thank you, Angelina, and to the CDA for all your good work in drawing attention to these important issues. And yes, that piece was penned with David Pratt, and he and I have known each other for some time and served together, albeit in different parties, and served as ministers of national defense. And so it was meant to demonstrate a few things. Firstly, that defense policy and direction should, for the most part, be a nonpartisan issue. And delving into the detail a little further and answering your question, current events, let's call them, certainly the U.S. election and tariffs in particular, and the president's insistence that Canada do more with respect to our own national defense, continental defense, and of course, reach the 2% threshold through NATO. Um, are not new demands or requests coming from the United States or other allies for that matter, but tone and tenure matter, and it has caused a lot of consternation, clearly, and a lot of pressure on the relationship, none of which I want to add is irreparable, but it does bring into question the current and foreseeable future um, sharing of information, direction, intelligence, and otherwise for the Canadian military and the U.S. military in particular. We, of course, are bound at the hip through NORAD and through NATO, but more broadly through a relationship that really goes back, to the 1930s and 40s. There's something, this maybe sound obscure, but it was referenced in the article. There's something called the Augsburg Agreement that was signed between then President Roosevelt and our Prime Minister Mackenzie King that set out this mutual defense relationship in more particular terms about, the fact that we would come to one another's assistance were an attack to occur. And that, of course, translated later into the NATO document in Article 5 and the Washington Treaty. But all of that to say, Angelina, we have a lot of history, a lot of shared history, a lot of important trust that has built up over those years. And so I, for one, believe that some of this may have been eroded, and it ebbs and flows, as the saying goes, between administrations and presidents and prime ministers, but it will prevail. And I do think that, if we continue to work at it and foster that relationship and essentially live up to our responsibilities to each other, then we can emerge from this current imbroglio, let's call it, and I think that we'll be able to get back to that institutional connective tissue that has made the defense relationship between Canada and the United States, I believe, the most important and connected on the planet.
Yeah, I appreciated that in your piece mentioning all of those moments when maybe people don't even remember some of those moments of that cooperation and partnership between our countries. And it's good to remember for all of us to have that top of mind. When you became the Minister of National Defense back in 2007, there was a lot of talk about upgrading Canadian military equipment, including the purchase of F-35s, which is now potentially off the table. You've previously called Canada's defense procurement system among the worst in the West. From your understanding, what have been some of those key challenges in Canadian defense procurement from your time in office until now? And what is the actual practicality of diversifying away from the US and looking for other options instead of the F-35s?
Well, let me take the latter part of that question first. I don't think we'll ever completely disengage from the United States with respect to procurement or otherwise. We just mentioned in terms of some of the strains that are on the relationship right now, and I'll come back to the F-35. But we have to look internally. We have to look at our current situation, which quite frankly wasn't brought about by the United States demands or anything that they've said or done. We've let our military languish. And like a muscle, it starts to atrophy when it isn't being used properly or exercised or or fed. And by that I mean given proper equipment, given proper support, whether it be salaries, whether it be for families, those important day-to-day, both administrative but practical caring demonstrated by the country, by the government through investment. And so focusing in on procurement, it's been broken and it's been broken for a long time. When I became defense minister in 2007, we were embroiled in a very real war in Afghanistan, where we had deployed a large number of Canadians into that theater of operations with insufficient equipment that wasn't protecting them, wasn't allowing them to effectively do their important work on the ground. They had Iltis light armored jeeps that had about the blast protection of a Volkswagen Rabbit. We had very insufficient air coverage in terms of helicopters and heavy lift. Even the forest green uniforms we sent them to Afghanistan wearing in a tan colored desert background was dangerous, was arguably negligent on the part of the Canadian government. And so we went about that rapidly to try to, of course, up the amount of support, both in terms of equipment, in terms of their operational abilities. They were working very closely with the Brits and the Americans. We were in Kandahar province, arguably the toughest part of the mission, the spiritual homeland of the Taliban, close to the Pakistan border. All of these circumstances conspired to make this a deadly mission, and we were losing soldiers at an alarming rate because of improvised explosive devices, full-on running, gunning battles like we saw in Operation Medusa and others. And so the imperative was for the government to act quickly. And, I had the good fortune of working with people like General Hillier and Atinchuk and later Lawson, and they were, very much engaged in the effort to accelerate the amount of equipment that we could procure and get it into Afghanistan, get it into that theater of operation, which in and of itself was an enormous logistical challenge. But I had the support of the Prime Minister, Stephen Harper. The Finance Minister, Jim Flaherty, was very, very open to the investments that we needed to make. But we quickly ran into, and this comes back to your question, this cross-threaded nature of procurement, where you have the Department of Public Works who are trying to design with justice perfect contracts, impenetrable contracts, virtually impossible. Industry Canada, of course, are tasked with trying to make much, if not all, of the equipment in Canada, also not a possibility. Treasury Board overseeing all of this, and the Department of National Defense pounding the table and saying people are dying. We need this equipment right away. And so we were able to cut through a lot of that. And there was, and this is the intangible element of it, Angelina, there was political will to make it happen, and there was public support to make it happen. Those very stark images of flag-draped coffins coming off the back of Hercules aircraft at our airfield was, jarring for Canadians. And it highlighted, of course, the sacrifice of both soldiers and their families and the nation. And so all of those things did allow, in my opinion, our government to move very quickly, relative to other eras in purchasing things like, heavy lift aircraft, C-130s, Globemasters, um, M777s, long range, guns, howitzers. We were able to get light armored vehicles, but up armored vehicles, really a much improved version of what we had seen previously, and main battle tanks, and proper uniforms, and body armor, and rifles, and all of the essentials really to prosecute that mission in a more effective way. The officials, both in uniform and public servants at the Department of National Defense, rallied around this cause, and we had the budget to do it. One of the it sounds counterintuitive now, but one of the biggest problems we had was spending our budget on time, because of some of these bureaucratic backlogs, but just there was so much money coming into the department. And simultaneously, like building an airplane engine in motion, we were seeing surges in recruitment, and we had to train. We had to a lot of reservists. We relied heavily on the reserve units across the country. So this is a long answer, but all of these moving parts came together quite, um, quickly and significantly to make those acquisitions of equipment happen. And I guess the big takeaway, Angelina, is that it can be done. Never waste a crisis is a well-worn expression, and that was certainly the case in Afghanistan. What's happening in the United States right now with this tearing at the relationship, the demands of other countries, NATO allies, obviously what we're seeing going on in this unlawful invasion of Ukraine by Russia, activities by the Chinese, aggressive activities in the South China Sea vis-à-vis Taiwan, the Middle East. All of this really, I think the geopolitical winds have shifted significantly since that time when I was minister. And again, we see the public making, I think, very reasoned but forceful demands for Canada to do more so that we can play a role, in terms of our NATO commitments, but equally importantly, perhaps more importantly, here protecting the continent of North America.
Yeah, absolutely. The geopolitical winds of change, economic winds of change. Uh, you mentioned, excuse me, you mentioned some of the potential difficulties of domestic procurement and totally switching from the system that we have now. There's a big push at the moment to buy Canadian across the board, and that includes for defense procurement. How do you imagine this impacting the domestic defense industry in the long run, if at all?
Well, I would hope, and I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but not unlike what we saw happening during the pandemic with COVID, um, there was this awakening on the part of Canadians and industry and government that, oh my goodness, we don't manufacture enough respirators or special masks or the type of medical garb or the necessary implements. Um, and so there was this surge of activity that then, of course, when COVID went away, a lot of that sort of fell to the wayside. But the same sort of recognition that we need to make more of our own equipment, I think, has been heightened in this time, perhaps even at a more um, forceful pace than we saw previously, because it was rather sudden. A lot of these tariffs and the relationship and the rhetoric around 51st state, and we've done it before. Again, we need to look a little bit back into history. I mean, where I live, just as an example, a little community called Trenton, where they poured the first steel in North America, and they made massive amounts of military equipment and shells and ammunition in an era when that was not an easy thing to do. We just down the coast from where I live is the Irving Shipyard, where we are recapitalizing the entire fleet of surface combatants. We've built Arctic offshore patrol vessels. There is a call now for more ice-breaking capability. There's discussion around what we need to also arm our Coast Guard with. And so I think, again, the public are slightly ahead of the politicians in terms of the recognition that we can make a lot of this equipment ourselves. And we should make this equipment ourselves so that we can control the supply chain and we can benefit from it. There's been efforts in the past, as you know, they called them offsets, or they would call them regional industrial benefits, regional technical benefits now is part of the discussion. And that's all fine and well, but we really need to build, the foundations and the capacity for some of these companies who struggle. And part of the reason they struggle, ironically, is that the government of Canada doesn't buy from them. They go through this very protracted competition in many cases where Canadian companies, are not necessarily given any preferential treatment for being Canadian and being able to do it maybe at a slightly higher cost, but at a much quicker delivery point with all of the added vulnerabilities of being in a global supply chain. So I think we should, and I think, whoever the new government is, whatever that administration does, they should be looking at military in particular, but even across the board. I mean, we don't make the type of farming equipment that we used to. We don't have enough marine capability. We don't have some of the very basic instruments and implements that really are going to help our economy. We become far too reliant, not only on the United States, but on China and other countries to make the things that we need and that we should make ourselves.
You touched a little bit on recruitment, and I think that's kind of the other side of this conversation. You have procurement and investing in Canadian equipment, and then you have investing in the people and the systems around that. In the Our North Strong and Free Defense Policy, it sets out the targets of 71,500 regular force and 30,000 reserve force members, hopefully recruited by 2032, primarily achieved by modernizing the Canadian Armed Forces recruitment process. What are some of the challenges of recruitment that you faced as Minister of National Defense? And do you believe that those are still the same challenges at play today, or how that issue is transforming?
Well, I think the challenges are different. I mentioned earlier that the prospects of actually deploying and being part of a mission are always going to be, spoken or unspoken, part of the draw to bring people into the Canadian Armed Forces. Young men and women want to just go somewhere. They want to, um, fulfill that promise of Canada helping other countries, of being part of a cause bigger than oneself, which the military do provide. The numbers are down, as you know, 15,000 or more, which is a crisis, actually, when one examines where we should be. And so the challenges are twofold. We don't face the current likelihood, at least nominally, of being in a place to deploy. We're in Latvia. That's seen as a training and a deterrence mission. We don't have the attraction, secondly, of offering young men and women the prospects of using state-of-the-art equipment. It's a hard thing to do to convince somebody who's in their mid-20s to fly a 45-year-old fighter jet. And the same is true of other equipment, or that we just don't have it at all, or that we don't have sufficient ammunition to do live fire exercises, and I could go on. So, reputationally, the Canadian Forces has taken a hit, and I'm not gonna go too far down this road, Angelina, but there is also a culture issue with the Canadian Armed Forces, where they've been scrutinized, some of which was deserved, but there was a feeling that we were, really trying to shape the Canadian Forces in a way that has not been in keeping with our traditions of being protectors, but also warriors, having the ability through force to back up our diplomatic interventions. And Canada has never been a country of conquerors. We have deployed to many parts of the world to try to protect vulnerable people. You know, the responsibility to protect was predicated on our ability to intervene when a government wasn't doing the right thing for its own people. And I'm grossly simplifying that, but the reality is that Canada has in some ways lost a bit of that raison d'être, or that ability to project hard power into the world when necessary, and most often in conjunction with other countries, you know, as a coalition. But we were leaders, and I think it's fair to say that we put a lot of that shine back on the Canadian Forces, even though the mission clearly didn't turn out as we had hoped. But in Afghanistan, we left very much with our reputation intact, especially among our allies who said, okay, Canada switched on and can do the business the way they always did, and they're prepared to step in and take, you know, a heavy load on their shoulders, which we absolutely did. They, the men and women of the armed forces, did, and the leadership that led them was extraordinary.
Yeah, very well said. Turning a little bit to our allies in NATO, um, most of our NATO allies in Europe, notably Poland at over 4% and the Baltics at all around 3%, have met or even surpassed the 2% of GDP for defense target. And some of them have plans to increase that number quite significantly over the coming years. What do you believe it will take for Canada to match the defense efforts of its European allies? And what are some of the systemic challenges that you see standing in our way?
Yeah, we've spoken a little bit about this already, Angelina, and in short, it is prioritizing the Canadian Forces. You know, governments face daily challenges and choices as to where to put taxpayers' money, and we should never forget that this money comes from hardworking men and women and Canadians everywhere who are risk takers, who are building things, who are trying to be prosperous and productive. And so there's a lot of churning that goes on within government, but I'm heartened to see that both of the main parties have committed to doing more and to reaching the 2% threshold. The demands that are the response to what's going on in the world, and I mentioned it earlier, in other parts of the world that could deteriorate further and may require Canadian involvement in a mission. Those those challenges very much put the emphasis back on the Canadian government rearming in a significant way, and also with respect to the challenges in the Arctic, and we can maybe unpack that a little further. So those demands are very real. They're live issues. Some countries are exceeding the 2%, as you've said, Poland among them. We just saw the addition of Sweden and Finland to the alliance, bringing that number to 32. The United States, who have always hovered between 4 and 5%, are actually contemplating downsizing some of their military. And we're getting mixed messages out of the Pentagon, but that that is also a very real consideration for countries like Canada and members of the NATO alliance to do more. And look, I've sat around those tables in Brussels and other meeting spots where the U.S. Defense Secretary was constantly, you know, asking, imploring Canada and others to do more. And but it was done subtly, and it was done behind closed doors, not sort of the bluster and boisterous attacks that we're getting now. But they're not wrong. You know, at the end of the day, they're not wrong that Canada should be doing more. And we sent a lot of our military equipment. I'm digressing a little bit, but we sent a lot of our equipment to Ukraine, which was absolutely the right thing to do. But we don't appear to have had a very significant plan to replenish. And I know Bill Blair is concerned about that, as was Anita Anand before him. And there's awareness, and then there's action. And you know, I'm still at the point where I want to believe that Canada is in a position to reach 2% with that political will in response to not only the military itself and the military community, organizations like the CDA. I really think that as part of that, woven into this rearmament will be a chance for the Canadian economy to capitalize on some of the technological advances that have been made. We can make drones, we can make undersea, autonomous vehicles. We're doing it now. We're doing it for commercial purposes. We're seeing a lot of great companies here on the East Coast, particularly around marine defense and security, come out with multi-use equipment that can be used, for example, to gauge, water temperatures and ice movement and coastal erosion and fish stocks, but also look for nuclear submarines coming near our shores. And so that's also, I think, more palatable to the public for those eye-watering investments. And it's big dollars, make no mistake about it. But if we, attack this issue properly, we can see a major return on that investment. In addition to, our capabilities, our operational offerings, we can also see a lot of good Canadian jobs advanced through this process.
You mentioned the Arctic and the war in Ukraine and uh, these shifting security theaters, as it were. Um, with the shifting foreign policies of our southern neighbor, as well as recent discussions in Europe about rearming, in your view, what is the likelihood of deeper defense integration between Canada and Europe, maybe specifically in areas like the Arctic and the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think it has to happen. I mean, Canada has always looked out into the world and aligned itself with like-minded, um, similar values countries. We've been the beneficiaries as a country of an influx of people from around the world. Our immigration um, is an indication of how the rest of the world views Canada. Now, again, don't want to get into partisan politics. Some of that is perhaps being questioned these days, but look, in reality, Canada is a country that works well, multinationally, internationally, plays well in the sandbox with others, shows up, tries mightily to do the right thing. And I suspect that, in the current climate with some of the strained relations, we will inevitably sort of migrate towards doing more with our traditional allies, UK, France, many of the European Union countries. And that includes on procurement projects, but it includes, our integration with military exchanges, working as we are in Latvia and other parts of the world on, what are described as peacekeeping or peacemaking, trying to show up in a way with some sufficiency of equipment and training that will add value to the mission. And that requires direction from the top, and it requires the political backing to get that work done. But it's certainly within the purview of any government to build on that important foundational reputation that Canada has, and now more than ever. And it's a bit of a cliche, but the world does need Canada. The world does need our military. We do things in a way that is admired, that is helpful, that doesn't storm in and tell everybody how it's going to happen, but tries to bring people to a common place. And when push comes to shove, we're also able to do some of the very difficult work that we did in places like Afghanistan, Bosnia, other parts of the world because of the courage, the commitment, and training of the Canadian Armed Forces.
I like how you put that, that the world needs Canada. I think there's also quite a lot of interest from Canadians as well to be uh, more of an international player and connect with our allies um, across the board. Where do you see Canada's role in helping to maintain that democratic rules-based international order, as we've seen at threat in Ukraine back in 2014 as well as 2022? What role does Canada have in ensuring peace and security internationally, maybe specifically in Europe, but um, with other theaters as well?
Well, what the Canadian Forces have done in the past, and I would include, our Herculean efforts to coordinate their efforts through then Department of Foreign Affairs, what they call Global now, and other departments working in concert, has been impactful and a source of pride, an important source of pride for Canada. And we've done that. One of the greatest examples goes back, a very long time, 80 years, was the first Special Service Force, the Devil's Brigade, who were commandos that really prepped the ground for the Normandy invasion. But we have other examples institutionally, the Permanent Joint Board of Defense on Defense. They also allow for there to be a greater understanding of what the needs to protect North America really are. So it's, working with our NORAD partnership in the United States through Colorado Springs and, controlling the airspace over North America. But, we are going to have to, practically speaking, come up with a much modernized system, a system of systems involving satellites, cyber, of course, ground-based information data gathering, and on the water, either through, as I mentioned earlier, those autonomous type of vessels or this new generation of Navy fleet, Royal Canadian Navy ships. And that, of course, also very much entails working with industry and coming out with technically advanced equipment. Where can Canada play its role? Well, it can only play a role, to state the obvious, if we do a number of these preparatory things and invest wisely and do so with a sense of urgency, which appears to be lacking. And it's lacking, in a word, because of politics and, lip service being paid to all of these things. And, I can sit here and tell you, as a former Minister of National Defense, I wish we'd done more. I wish we'd been able to make more investments. We did a lot, for which I am proud. And we saw the Canadian Forces in an advantageous position, more advantageous than they had been for decades, when we left government in 2015. But yes, there's always more that could have been done. And so governments need to be ambitious. They need to have vision as to what the Canadian Forces should look like and how they should contribute internationally and on the home game, the home front. And I believe that it really is, as JTF2 famously put it, deeds, not words. That's their unit's motto. And we need to see a lot more action, a lot more investment, a lot more planning for the future. The Canada First defense strategy could be dusted off, and that's not to, again, undermine what the current defense white paper document looks like, but there are important areas of investment, particularly in the Arctic, that we need to address. Having an operational hub there is a big part of that. Having landing strips and capabilities permanently placed in the Arctic, more Arctic Rangers. And the last thing I'll say on sort of a more diplomatic front is when working with our NATO allies, there's an overlap obviously with the European Union, but there's an Arctic Council currently suspended because of Russia. But we should be looking to those Arctic nations and further afield, even to non-NATO countries. I think of South Korea. I think of Australia. I mean, countries who are also looking out into the world and saying, we need friends and allies more than ever. And perhaps we need to jointly procure certain types of equipment. Submarines is the obvious example, but the F-35, which has had a long and somewhat twisting journey as far as Canada is concerned because of politics. But those type of collaborations result in the ability to build equipment faster and to deliver capabilities to the men and women in uniform who need it most.
Very well said. I want to get into the politics of it all, as you said. Um, in 2023, you wrote a piece where you called for depoliticizing defense. Can you speak a bit more about that and specifically how you see defense playing a role in the upcoming election here in Canada?
Yeah, I mean, by depoliticizing, I mean doing away with the spectacle of an incoming government canceling major procurement projects that have a long history of investment and involvement. And I'm talking about the F-35, but I could also reference the Sea King replacement, where incoming government says, no, we're not going to buy Cadillac equipment because the previous government promised that it was too expensive, and then ended up buying the same aircraft, the same airframe, at a massive cost to the Treasury, to the taxpayers, by the way. Penalty clause for breaking the contract, plus you're flying an older aircraft longer than its life expectancy. And then, for a period of time, the transition of using two different platforms, that also cost the Treasury. With F-35, we're seemingly ready to hit the pause button again, even though this is a important fifth generation stealth aircraft whose development history goes back to the 90s. So there's actually been now 4 different governments that have had a touch on this particular aircraft, which we badly need. I mean, the current fleet of CF-18s are 45 years old or will be older by the time we take full delivery of a replacement fleet. And so, I mean, that's just maybe an obvious example of where politics got in the way. Criticisms of that aircraft that it didn't fly simply were not true. And there are 19 different countries and soon to be more flying that aircraft. Interoperability, I have to inject here, is an important consideration for certain types of equipment, as is, to be fair, the possibility that the intellectual property owned by Lockheed Martin and controlled by the United States government, it has to be considered, as does the supply chain, where in the original contract, it was envisioned that Canada would make a lot of parts, not just for the fleet that we were purchasing, but for the global supply chain. And all of that has to be negotiated early on and predicated on the follow through as opposed to the stops and starts of cancellations and re-engagement. So one way to achieve, I think, greater efficiencies, Angelina, is to have a military department of procurement or a focus, if you will, on doing it right, taking away, the politicization around the cost. I mean, it's triggering in a way because I mean, I was criticized for saying we were undervaluing the actual cost of the contract. Well, the information I'm getting is not made up. It's coming from nonpartisan professional public servants at the Department of National Defense and Public Works and others. They're providing the information. But then you have the Auditor General, the Parliamentary Budget Office, and a ginned up opposition who see a vulnerability to embarrass the government. And so taking a step back, and I served in opposition and government, one would hope, maybe naively, even after all these years, that there is a much higher priority on fighter planes than photocopiers. We need to try to remove that thorn when it comes to the tendency to skewer the government over the cost of military spending. It's expensive to protect our freedoms and our liberties and everything we hold dear. And I'm quick to add, protect the lives of those men and women who stand in harm's way and are ready to leave behind everything that they hold dear to go off and complete, hopefully successfully, missions in the name of our country. So it requires a meeting of the minds, and it requires sort of a higher calling from our politicians to make these things happen, both the procurement and resisting the knee-jerk reaction of criticizing the government. Not to suggest, that they get a pass, but if we could just try to be a little bit more both constructive and factual on these discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're still hoping to see over the next few weeks that's left in the different campaigns what comes up on defense and our national security issues. And like you said, whatever new government comes in afterwards, hopefully they're able to tackle some of these big challenges that we talked about today.
The investments in our intelligence capabilities. Communication security establishment is a big part of national defense that very few people know and understand. But our ability to collect and share intelligence to prevent attacks and threats and theft of intellectual property and intrusions into government, very important. We've seen a study on foreign interference in elections and otherwise, and that is, a clear indication that we need to do more in that regard as well. And it's a big, important, intangible, and unseen part of our defense apparatus. And yet there it is. I think there's probably heightened awareness of this given, the foreign interference inquiry, but we have seen and experienced what happens in the business world when these external forces are able to get into the systems and shut them down, or through ransomware demand monies. Um, and it all overlaps, of course, with public safety and the need to also share intelligence with our police services.
Yeah, I think some of those. I appreciate you saying that it does come into conversations on defense. I think it's easy to uh, put issues of intelligence or things like disinformation and other maybe hybrid warfare tactics as kind of secondary, as we've seen in Europe, for example, a lot of the sabotage in the North and Baltic seas. There's a lot of questions of, is it war, is it not war, and where do we draw that line? So I think for Canada as well, it's important for us to understand that, and for Canadians to be aware of where we ourselves draw that line and where we get involved.
Domestic terrorism is still a very real issue, and
Hmm.
as is critical infrastructure interference and damage and destruction. Those are live issues as well. And aid to civilian authority is a big part of the Department of National Defense, as is their response to climate issues and emergencies brought about by severe weather.
Yeah.
Search and rescue. We didn't mention search and rescue, which is we have extraordinary heroes within our SARTEC units and those who deploy when people are in trouble here in Canada or off our shores.
I do believe that we could go on all day and talk about all of the various, very critical parts of Canadian national security and defense. Do you have any final comments, Mr. MacKay, that you'd like to add to maybe wrap up this great discussion that we've had?
Well, thank you, Angelina, again to you and the CDAI for bringing these issues to the forefront. I hope and pray that we have more of these discussions and that they make their way into the leaders' debates, that they make their way into public discourse, but most importantly, that they find themselves on the incoming government's agenda. And that is done for the right reasons, for the practical reasons, some of which we've discussed here today. And I'm confident that good people can make good things through the Parliament of Canada if they turn their minds to it. And trying to be an optimist in these dark, dangerous, uncharted waters is sometimes a challenge. But, I was reminded by a veteran, a wonderful woman here in Nova Scotia named Merle Taylor, who was a wireless operator in the Second World War, and she lived to be almost 100. And I remember during the pandemic visiting her in the hospital, and it was a very challenging time for everybody, obviously. But she reminded me, we've seen worse, and we've been through worse. And Canadians are tough and are able to persevere and have good hearts and good tissue that are ready to lend themselves to a cause that is worthy. So let's get behind those who do that important work for our country and give them the tools and the implements that they need to get that work done, and then come home
Well,
to their families.
well said, of course. Great. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Angelina. All the best.
That brings us to the end of this pod. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform so that you never miss an update. For more in-depth analysis and updates on national security and defense, be sure to visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca, where you can find articles, reports, and more. Thank you for listening. We hope you'll be tuning in next time.